It begins in darkness. A darkness absolute, a primordial black that clings to the ancient stones of Rome like a shroud. This is not the gentle dark of a sleeping city, but a heavy, watchful void, cold and pregnant with menace. Before the sun even considers violating the horizon, before the faintest spectral gray dares to outline the famed Seven Hills, in the bone-deep chill of February 17th, 1600, something wicked is stirring. Deep within the bowels of a stone fortress, in a cell that has been his universe for nearly 8 agonizing years, a man is roused. His name is Giordano Bruno. For 2,920 days, his world has been the damp chill of stone, the scuttling of rats, and the echoing screams of other forgotten souls. His eyes, long accustomed to the gloom, have forgotten the full light of the sun. His body, once vibrant and restless, is now a cage of atrophied muscle and aching joints. He is led from this hole, his bare feet recoiling from the freezing floor, not into freedom, but into the final act of a long and meticulously orchestrated nightmare. They haul him into the pre-dawn air, a gasp of frigid dampness that feels more like a lungful of grave dirt than of life. The city is a labyrinth of winding, narrow streets, and through them, he is paraded, not with the dignity of a man walking to his fate, but with the calculated degradation of a monster being put on display. He is hoisted onto the back of a mule, the traditional mount of a fool, and the procession of pure humiliation begins. It is a slow, deliberate journey through the waking city, a theater of shame designed to strip away not just his life, but his very humanity. Their destination is the Campo dei Fiori, the Field of Flowers. The name is a grotesque irony on this day. There are no flowers here, only a ravenous sea of upturned faces, a mob hungry for a spectacle of death. In the center of this bustling marketplace, a crude stage has been set. A towering pyre of rough-hewn wood and sticky, flammable pitch waits for him, a hungry wooden beast promising an agonizing end. The crowd presses in, their breath misting in the cold air, their eyes alight with a grim and feverish excitement. They are here for the show. They are here for the blood. But the final, most intimate act of cruelty is yet to come. Before they commit his body to the flames, they must first conquer his mind, his voice, his soul. Before they light the fire, they perform one last, brutal assertion of their absolute control, an act of such specific terror it would be remembered for centuries. They were afraid, not of his fists, not of any weapon he could wield, but of his words. They were pathologically terrified of what he might say in his last moments, of the final, defiant truths or curses that might escape his lips and poison the minds of the assembled masses. So, they came for his tongue. They forced a brutal gag into his mouth, a spike designed to pin the muscle of his speech, to impale the very instrument of his genius. Some historical accounts call it a bridle, a vicious iron clamp that locked his jaw and drove a point through his tongue, ensuring his silence with excruciating pain. They wrote, with a chilling matter-of-factness, that his tongue was wicked and had to be disciplined. Only then, with the philosopher physically muted, his last words choked into a bloody gurgle, did they feel safe enough to burn him alive. What unimaginable horror could a single human voice contain to provoke such a reaction from an empire that spanned the globe? What idea could be so profoundly dangerous, so existentially terrifying, that the most powerful and ruthless institution on the planet would resort to such medieval barbarism to prevent it from being heard? What truth was so potent that they needed to not only kill the man, but mutilate his very capacity for speech before doing so? This is the story of Giordano Bruno, the philosopher whose mind they could not chain, whose voice they could not break, and whose legacy they could not burn. This is the chronicle of the man they had to silence, and the universe of beautiful, terrifying infinity that he dared to imagine. To comprehend the inferno that was built to consume Giordano Bruno, you must first immerse yourself in the suffocating atmosphere of the world that lit it. The late 1500s were not a time of gentle intellectual curiosity. They were an age of profound, existential anxiety, a period of seismic, soul-shattering change. The ground beneath Europe was not solid. It was a web of fractures, ready to swallow the unwary. Less than a century before, a stubborn German monk named Martin Luther had hammered his own theses to a church door, and with each nailfall, He had struck a crack in the monolithic facade of Western Christendom. That crack had splintered, widened, and erupted into the Protestant Reformation, a bloody, chaotic schism that tore the continent apart. The Catholic Church, the undisputed spiritual and political authority for 1,000 years, was now wounded, bleeding, and pathologically defensive. In its agony, it lashed out with the Counter-Reformation, a powerful, often monstrous, reassertion of its absolute dominion over body, mind, and soul. At the bloody heart of this crusade was the holy office of the Inquisition, a court born of paranoia and fed by fear. It was a sprawling, shadowy bureaucracy of priests, spies, and torturers, established with a single, chilling purpose: to hunt, identify, and utterly eradicate heresy wherever it could be found. In this world, ideas were not abstract concepts to be debated in quiet libraries. They were living, infectious things. They were plagues of the soul. To challenge the dogma of the Church was not merely to disagree. It was to commit an act of cosmic treason, to undermine the very fabric of society, the fundamental nature of reality, and the unassailable authority of God Himself. Into this crucible of fervent, fanatical belief and deadly political intrigue, in the year 1548, Filippo Bruno was born. From his earliest years, he was a walking paradox, brilliant beyond measure, yet possessed by a restless, defiant spirit that chafed against any and all authority. His mind was not a placid lake of contemplation. It was a supernova of insatiable curiosity, a raging fire that drove him instinctively towards subjects others deemed forbidden, dangerous, or demonic. At the tender age of 17, he made a decision that would seal his fate. He joined the prestigious Dominican order, taking the name Giordano, and stepped directly into the intellectual heart of the establishment he would one day threaten to upend. This was a catastrophic mismatch. The Dominicans were meant to be the Domini Canes, the hounds of the Lord, the disciplined intellectual soldiers and watchdogs of Catholic orthodoxy. But Bruno was no one's dog. He was a wolf. He was an explorer, and the sanctioned territory of the mind was, to him, a prison. He felt an irresistible urge to venture far beyond the approved boundaries of thought, into the wilderness where monsters were said to dwell. He didn't just read books, he devoured them. He feasted on philosophy, the intricate and mystical arts of memory, and the shadowy, occult traditions of the ancient world. He questioned everything, not with the gentle skepticism of a scholar, but with the aggressive, relentless probing of a demolitionist. He sought out and consumed forbidden works, texts that were whispered about in shadowed corners, books that promised damnation. He cast doubt on the most sacred tenets of his faith, the holy doctrine of the Trinity, the divine nature of Christ, and other core beliefs he had taken a holy vow to uphold and defend. In an act of shocking defiance, he even purged his monastic cell of all traditional religious icons and saints, keeping only a simple, stark crucifix, as if to say his relationship with the divine was his and his alone. His superiors, men trained to sniff out the slightest scent of dissent, grew deeply suspicious. An investigation was launched. To the Church of the Counter-Reformation, doubt was a contagion, a spiritual leprosy, and Giordano Bruno was a superspreader. In 1576, faced with a formal trial he knew he could not survive with his mind or soul intact, he did what he would be forced to do for the next 15 years of his life. He ran. Casting off his monk's habit like a snake shedding its skin, Giordano Bruno became a fugitive, an intellectual vagabond on a desperate pilgrimage not to a holy shrine, but to the farthest, most dangerous frontiers of the human mind. This was no quiet, scholarly retreat. Bruno's journey was a storm front of controversy and chaos tearing across the map of Europe. He fled to Geneva, the very heart of Calvinist Protestantism, hoping to find refuge among the Church's enemies. He was promptly excommunicated by them, too, after he published a blistering attack on one of their most distinguished professors. He moved on to France, where his astonishing intellect and prodigious memory found him temporary favor in the court of King Henry III. He dazzled the Parisian elite, a rock star of philosophy who could perform seemingly magical feats of recall. From there, he journeyed to England, lecturing at the hallowed halls of Oxford. It was here that he began to publicly champion the still radical and deeply controversial ideas of a Polish astronomer named Nicholas Copernicus, who had dared to whisper the blasphemy that the Earth was not the center of all creation, but that it revolved, like a servant, around the sun. But Bruno did not merely champion Copernicus's theory. He seized it, weaponized it, and launched it into terrifying, uncharted depths. This is the precise moment where Bruno the troublemaker transformed into Bruno the arch-heretic. This is the point where he began to construct the intellectual edifice that would one day become his funeral pyre. Because for Giordano Bruno, a sun-centered solar system was not the destination. It was merely the first, timid step into a cosmos more vast, more alien, more terrifying, and more magnificent than anyone had ever dared to conceive. To the mind of the 16th century church, the universe was a place of deep comfort, order, and profound personal significance. It was a neat, tidy, and blessedly finite creation, a set of crystalline spheres nested one inside the other like a Russian doll, with a flawed, corrupted Earth placed deliberately at its very center. Above this terrestrial stage lay the unchanging perfection of the heavens, the abode of God and his angels. Below lay the fiery pits of hell. Humanity was the undisputed star of this divine drama, the focus of all creation, and the church was its sole, divinely appointed director. Copernicus had already introduced a disturbing plot twist by deposing the Earth and placing the sun at the center. But even he was cautious. He kept the universe small, contained, safely enclosed in a final, outermost sphere of fixed stars. He rattled the cage, but he didn't break it open. Giordano Bruno obliterated it. He took Copernicus's sun-centered model, fused it with the resurrected writings of ancient automist philosophers and his own ecstatic, mystical insights, and from this volatile mixture, he forged a new cosmology. And it was a cosmology that the church found not just scientifically incorrect, but spiritually monstrous, a vision of reality born from the deepest pits of hell. First, and most horrifically, Bruno declared that the universe was infinite. It had no center, no boundary, no edge. This was not a mere scientific proposition. It was a devastating theological assault. An infinite universe is a terrifying concept. If the cosmos is boundless, where is heaven? Where is God's celestial throne? The entire geography of salvation, so clearly mapped out, simply disintegrates. In a centerless, boundless cosmos, the privileged, central position of humanity, and by extension, the earth and the church itself, evaporates into meaninglessness. We are no longer the celebrated protagonists of God's personal play. We are adrift, lost, infinitesimal specks in an endless, silent, and utterly indifferent expanse. This was the birth of cosmic horror. Second, if the universe is truly infinite, then the stars could no longer be quaint little lights studding a celestial canopy for our viewing pleasure. Bruno, with a staggering leap of pure intuition that science would not confirm for centuries, argued that the stars must be other suns. Countless, fiery suns, just like our own, scattered across the terrifying emptiness. And if they were suns, he reasoned with chilling logic, then they must also have planets orbiting them, other Earths, unseen, unknown, and infinite in number. This led him to his most dangerous, his most explosive, his most unforgivable heresy, the plurality of worlds. Bruno didn't just suggest these other worlds existed. He proposed that these countless other Earths were not barren rocks or empty deserts. They could be, and likely were, inhabited, teeming with their own strange forms of life, their own intelligent beings, their own civilizations. This single idea struck like a dagger at the very heart of the Christian faith. The entire structure of sin and salvation, the story upon which all of the church's power was built, depended on its uniqueness. If there are other worlds populated by other thinking beings, did Jesus of Nazareth die for their sins, too? Was the Son of God incarnated and crucified on every single one of those countless worlds, in an endless, repeating cycle of cosmic passion plays? Or did they have their own saviors, their own prophets, their own gods? The unique, central, earth-shattering story of salvation simply crumbled into absurdity in the face of an infinite cosmos teeming with alien life. But he wasn't finished. He pushed even further into the shadowy, forbidden realm of pantheism. He argued that God was not some external king, a celestial emperor sitting on a throne outside of his own creation, judging it from a distance. For Bruno, God was the universe. God was immanent, present in every leaf, every drop of water, every grain of sand, every distant, burning star, every living person. Nature, he wrote with terrifying simplicity, is none other than God in things. This single statement dissolved the sacred distinction between the creator and the creation. It implied that one could find and experience the divine by studying the natural world, not just by participating in the rituals and sacraments of the church. It made the church, with its popes, its cardinals, and its inquisitors, horrifically, terrifyingly, unnecessary. For 16 years, this man, possessed by a vision that others could only see as madness, wandered Europe like a prophet of a new and terrible religion. From France to England, then on to Germany, he was a whirlwind of activity, lecturing, writing, debating, and arguing with a furious passion. He was a man possessed by his own vision, a figure of dazzling charisma and intellect, but also an arrogant, abrasive, and deeply provocative personality who made powerful enemies as easily and as often as he made devoted friends. After clashing violently with the Lutherans in Germany, he was excommunicated yet again, finding himself a man without a home, intellectually, spiritually, or physically. Yet, despite the clear and escalating danger, despite the enemies piling up like bodies in his wake, in the year 1591, he made a decision that can only be described as fatal. He accepted an invitation to go back to Italy. Why? Why would a man whose very thoughts were deemed a spiritual poison, a man who was already a notorious fugitive from the Roman Inquisition, willingly walk back into the lion's den? The answer, tragically, lies in a gilded invitation from a Venetian nobleman named Giovanni Mocenigo. Mocenigo was a man of some standing, but his intellect was shallow and his soul was consumed by a lust for the arcane. He had heard the whispers of Bruno's fame and was particularly captivated by his legendary art of memory, a complex system of mnemonic techniques that Bruno taught. Mocenigo, in his ignorance, likely believed this was not a mere memory aid, but a key to unlocking some form of occult or magical power. He invited Bruno to Venice to serve as his private tutor, dangling the promise of protection and patronage. For Bruno, a man perpetually on the run, perhaps it seemed like a final, desperate chance to find a stable foothold in his own homeland, to influence the elite of one of Italy's great republics. It was a terrible and terminal miscalculation. The relationship was doomed from the start. It was a partnership between a man wrestling with the infinite nature of God and a man who wanted to learn magical party tricks. Mocenigo grew intensely frustrated. He felt that Bruno, the great master, was holding back the true secrets, the real power. He had paid for a sorcerer and received a philosopher. Bruno, in turn, found his host to be a disappointingly dull and spiritually inert student, incapable of grasping the cosmic grandeur of his ideas. The atmosphere in Mocenigo's palazzo grew thick with resentment and suspicion. After a few tense months, Bruno, likely sensing the growing danger and disgusted with his student, announced he was leaving for Frankfurt to oversee the printing of a new book. This appears to have been the final straw for the unstable Mocenigo. Whether it was out of petty spite for being abandoned, genuine religious panic at the heresies he had been exposed to, or a craven desire to win favor with the authorities, Mocenigo decided to act. On the night of May 22, 1592, as Bruno prepared to depart, he found his way barred. Mocenigo, with the help of his servants, physically imprisoned his guest within the house. The trap had been sprung. The very next day, Giovanni Mocenigo made his way to the local offices of the Venetian Inquisition and denounced the man who had been sleeping under his roof. Mocenigo's testimony was a methodical and damning catalog of blasphemy. He accused Bruno of a horrifying list of heresies, many of which were, from the church's perspective, absolutely true. He testified that Bruno had claimed Christ was not God but a mere magician, that there was no real punishment for sin, and that human souls, upon death, could be reincarnated into animals. Most damningly, he reported Bruno's denial of the Trinity and his fanatical belief in an infinite number of worlds. It was a comprehensive indictment, a death warrant delivered by the very man who had lured him back to Italy with promises of safety. The Venetian Inquisition acted swiftly. Bruno was arrested and thrown into their prison. At first, the seasoned debater defended himself with skill and cunning, attempting to draw a fine line between his philosophical speculations and established theological truths. It seemed, for a moment, that he might just talk his way out of it, as he had managed to do so many times before. But the authorities in Rome had been hunting Giordano Bruno for years. He was not some local peasant who had uttered a minor blasphemy. He was an infamous, international figure, an intellectual celebrity who had spread his toxic ideas across the courts and universities of Europe. The Roman Inquisition, the supreme and most powerful body of its kind, wanted him. They viewed him as the mastermind of a spiritual plague, and they sent a formal, non-negotiable request to the government of Venice: extradite Giordano Bruno to Rome. The Republic of Venice, proud and historically independent, could have refused. Protecting their sovereignty against papal overreach was a point of civic pride. But after a series of intense political maneuvers and backroom deals, they capitulated. In February of 1593, Giordano Bruno was formally handed over. He was transported in chains to the dungeons of the Holy Office in Rome. He was now in the hands of the most feared and efficient organization in all of Christendom. The philosophical debates were over. His final trial, a trial for his very soul, had begun. For 7 long years, Giordano Bruno was swallowed by the prisons of the Roman Inquisition. 7 years. Over 2,500 days spent in relentless confinement, crushing isolation, and a state of unceasing psychological warfare. The primary goal of the Inquisition was not, contrary to popular belief, mere execution. That was a last resort, a public admission of failure. The true goal was to save the heretic's soul, which, in their terms, meant forcing the accused to recant. They sought the spectacle of a broken mind, the public performance of a full and groveling confession, a powerful demonstration that in the end, every knee bows to the authority of the church. One of the leading figures on the panel of cardinals who sat in judgment of him was Robert Bellarmine, one of the most brilliant, formidable, and ruthless theologians of the age. This was the same man who, years later, would oversee the first inquisitorial proceedings against Galileo Galilei. To Bellarmine, Bruno was not simply a misguided man. He was a conscious and malignant agent of chaos, a profound and existential threat to the entire spiritual order of the world. He was a cancer that had to be cut out. The trial was a slow, grinding, bureaucratic machine of terror. Inquisitors, working with methodical patience, meticulously combed through every page of Bruno's published works, every surviving letter, every recorded debate, compiling an exhaustive list of his heresies. Bellarmine, with the precision of a surgeon, eventually distilled all the charges down to 8 core, non-negotiable propositions. These were the 8 hills on which Bruno's soul would either live or die. He would have to renounce them all, completely, and without reservation, to save his life. While the full, official list of those 8 propositions has been lost to time, swallowed by the Vatican's archives, surviving records of the trial tell us everything we need to know. They undoubtedly included his pantheistic belief that God and the infinite universe are one and the same. They certainly included his shattering vision of an infinite cosmos filled with a plurality of worlds. And at their very heart was his denial of core Catholic dogma, especially the divinity of Jesus and the nature of the Holy Trinity. This was not a trial about 1 or 2 bad ideas. It was a trial of an entire worldview, a prosecution of a man's very mind. Bruno was being asked to stand before his accusers and declare that his entire life's work, the magnificent and terrifying cosmos he had discovered, was a lie. He was being asked to renounce himself. He tried to negotiate. He attempted to distinguish between what he held as a philosopher and what the church held as a matter of faith. At one point, facing the abyss, he even seemed ready to offer a partial recantation, a compromise that might spare his body. But Bellarmine and the Inquisition were immovable. They demanded total, unconditional, abject surrender. There was no room for negotiation, no possibility of compromise. Bruno would have to get on his knees, physically and spiritually, and declare his entire intellectual journey a demonic delusion. It remains unclear if Bruno was subjected to physical torture, though the threat of the rack and the strappado was a constant, looming presence in the interrogation chambers of the Holy Office. But after 7 years locked in a dungeon, facing the most formidable and feared intellects in all of Europe, Bruno's resolve did not finally break. It hardened into something unbreakable. He stared into the face of his own annihilation and saw the choice with a terrifying, crystalline clarity. He could save his body by sacrificing his mind, or he could save his mind, his integrity, his truth, his very soul, by sacrificing his body. He chose his truth. In his final confrontations with his judges, he dropped all pretense of negotiation or compromise. His defiance became absolute, a firewall against their power. He finally, irrevocably declared that he had nothing to retract and nothing to repent. He stood by every word he had ever written, every idea he had ever conceived. The Inquisition had failed. They had used every tool in their arsenal: isolation, fear, psychological manipulation, theological brilliance, and they could not break him. All that was left to them now was the crude, primitive act of destruction. On February 8, 1600, he was brought from his cell for the last time to stand before the tribunal and have his death sentence formally read to him. As the powerful men who held his life in their hands pronounced their judgment, that he be delivered to the secular authorities to be punished as mercifully as possible and without the shedding of blood, the standard euphemism for being burned alive. Giordano Bruno looked them directly in the eye. With a voice steady and clear, he uttered the words that would immortalize his defiance and haunt his judges forever. Perhaps you, my judges, pronounce this sentence against me with greater fear than I receive it. In that one sentence, he reversed the flow of power. He saw right through their robes and their rituals to the terror in their hearts. He knew their entire system was built on the foundation of fear, and he was showing them, in their moment of ultimate triumph, that he was no longer afraid. In that moment, he had already won. Dawn, February 17, 1600. The day is deliberately chosen. It is the day after Ash Wednesday, a solemn day of penance and mortality in the Christian calendar, a choice designed to amplify the symbolic horror of the event. The Campo da Fiori is already swarming, a churning sea of humanity. In the 17th century, a public execution was not a somber affair. It was a form of grotesque public theater, a brutal and explicit message sent from the powerful to the powerless. Bruno, the proud philosopher who had debated in royal courts and dazzled Europe's elite, is subjected to the final, calculated indignities. He is forced to ride on a mule, a public mockery of Christ's entry into Jerusalem, but twisted into an image of a fool's parade. He is led slowly through the gawking, jeering crowd to the center of the square, and there, he is stripped of his clothes, a final act of humiliation to rob him of his identity and reduce him to mere flesh. As he is dragged towards the stake, members of a religious brotherhood, the so-called comforters of the dead, walk beside him. They are draped in hooded robes, their faces hidden, chanting prayers and psalms, relentlessly urging him one last time to repent, to kiss the cross, to save his soul. Their presence is part of the performance, a living tableau meant to scream a single message to the crowd. Asterisk, this is what happens. This is what happens when you defy God's holy church. Asterisk. But the authorities harbored one specific, gnawing fear: Bruno's voice. They were haunted by the power of his words, even in these, his final moments. What if he uttered a final, compelling heresy that might plant a seed of doubt in the crowd? What if he pronounced a powerful curse upon his judges? What if he cried out with such conviction that he turned himself from a reviled criminal into a holy martyr in the eyes of the people? They could not, would not allow it. And so, they brought out the gag, the spike, the iron bridle. Eyewitness accounts, letters written in the days following the execution, describe a horrific device, a leather bridle fitted with an iron clamp and a sharp point, specifically designed to hold his jaw shut and pierce his tongue, nailing it to the roof or floor of his mouth. His wicked words, as one contemporary report chillingly put it, were now physically imprisoned in a cage of iron and agony. He was silenced. They tie him, naked and bleeding from the mouth, to the stake. A comforter, relentless in his duty, thrusts a crucifix into his face, offering one last, desperate chance for salvation. Bruno, his face a mask of unimaginable pain and unbreakable defiance, turns his head away. It is the only act of resistance left to him. It is enough. The pyre is lit. The flames, hungry and orange, lick at the dry wood, then at his feet. They climb his legs, his torso, consuming his body in a wave of unbearable agony. The crowd watches the philosopher burn. They watch the man who spoke of infinite worlds being reduced to a finite pile of ash and charred bone. His screams are muffled, choked by the gag and drowned out by the roaring, crackling inferno. The church had made its point with fire and iron. But even this complete physical annihilation was not the end. To ensure his memory was utterly and completely obliterated, to deny his followers a grave or a relic to which they might one day make a pilgrimage, his ashes were carefully collected from the embers of the pyre. They were carried to the Ponte Sant'Angelo, and there they were cast into the muddy, flowing waters of the Tiber River to be scattered and washed away to the sea. They had tried to erase Giordano Bruno from the face of the earth. They had silenced his tongue, burned his body, and scattered his remains into the water. They truly believed they had extinguished the fire of Giordano Bruno forever. They were wrong. In the immediate aftermath, the church's brutal message appeared to be terrifyingly effective. The horrific, theatrical spectacle of Bruno's execution served as a potent and chilling warning to any mind that dared to stray from the path of orthodoxy. 16 years later, when Galileo Galilei, a far more famous and respected astronomer, faced the same Roman Inquisition for defending the same Copernican idea that the earth moves, the ghost of Giordano Bruno surely loomed large in the chamber. The memory of the stake, the gag, and the flames was still fresh. Galileo, perhaps wisely, chose to live. He recanted. He was sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his life, not to the stake. The system of fear had worked. For centuries, Bruno became a half-forgotten footnote in history, a boogeyman, a dark cautionary tale whispered among philosophers about the fatal price of arrogance and heresy. He was the man who went too far. But ideas are more resilient than flesh. An idea cannot be gagged by an iron spike. An idea cannot be consumed by fire. An idea, once it has been set loose upon the world, can never be truly killed or erased. As the centuries passed and the world changed, Giordano Bruno was rediscovered. During the intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment, he was resurrected and hailed as a forerunner of free thought and rationalism. Then, in the 19th century, during a period of rising nationalism and secularism in a unifying Italy, he was transformed into something more. He became a potent symbol, a martyr not for any specific theological or scientific point, but for the freedom of the mind itself. A hero in the eternal struggle of science and philosophy against the tyranny of dogmatic oppression. This slow resurrection culminated in an astonishing act of defiance in 1889. On the exact spot in the Campo dei Fiori where he had been burned alive, a monument was erected in his name. Against fierce, furious opposition from the Vatican, which saw the statue as a grave insult, a coalition of students, intellectuals, and free thinkers from around the world raised funds to erect a statue in his honor. There he stands to this day, a dark, brooding, bronze figure, his face shadowed by a monk's cowl, his gaze locked in a posture of eternal, defiant accusation, turned forever towards the Vatican. The inscription on its base is a testament to the power of his ghost. To Bruno, from the generation he foresaw, here where the pyre burned. The site of his execution, a space that was meant to signify the ultimate, unchallengeable power of the church to crush dissent, had been reclaimed by the ghost of its victim. It was now a monument to the power of a single, terrifying idea to outlive its persecutors and to see its own vindication. So why did they fear him with such pathological intensity? Because Giordano Bruno's ideas didn't just challenge one or two doctrines. They presented an entirely different reality. A reality that was vast, chaotic, and terrifyingly infinite. A reality in which humanity was not the privileged center of the universe, and the church was not the sole gatekeeper of truth. His cosmology dethroned humanity. His pantheism decentralized God. His philosophy empowered the individual to seek out truth on their own terms, armed with nothing but their own reason and intuition. That kind of idea is a contagion of the mind. Once it is planted, it can grow in the darkness, spreading from one mind to another until it is strong enough to transform the world. They gagged him because they understood, with a clarity that we have perhaps forgotten, that a single voice armed with a powerful enough idea is more dangerous than any army. They couldn't debate his ideas, so they were forced to destroy the man who spoke them. But in doing so, they inadvertently guaranteed his immortality, proving the very point he embodied with his life and his death. You can kill a philosopher, but you cannot kill philosophy. The fire in the Campo dei Fiori went out in a few hours, but the fire he lit in the human mind burns to this very day.